Marry me before it's too late. Clara Whitfield said, "It's standing on a stranger's porch in the cold." Her hands shaking, her voice steady. She had ridden 40 minutes through wind that cut like a blade to ask a widowed rancher she barely knew to become her husband before Friday's court hearing destroyed everything her father had ever built. She expected questions. She expected refusal. She expected anything except the one word Everett Hayes gave her without hesitation. Yes. If you're new here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Clara had not slept in 4 days. Not real sleep. Not the kind where your body actually lets go, and your mind goes quiet, and you wake up feeling like a person again. She had been lying in the same bed where her father died 11 months ago, staring at the ceiling in the dark, doing math that never worked out in her favor. Running numbers in her head over and over, until the numbers stopped being numbers and started being faces her father's face. Her mother's, her younger brother Tommy, who died at 19 from a fever that a proper doctor might have caught in time if they'd had any money left. All of them gone. All of them buried on land that a man named Marcus Bell was now claiming did not legally belong to her. She got out of bed at 4 in the morning on a Tuesday and went to the kitchen table and opened the ledger again. She had read every page so many times that the ink had begun to blur. But she kept reading, because reading felt like doing something. And doing something felt better than lying in the dark, thinking about how little time she had left. Friday was 4 days away. The county hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning, and Marcus Bell's lawyer had already filed 3 separate documents, claiming that her Fistfiesland deed contained a technical error that invalidated the original purchase. Clara had taken those documents to every person she could think of. The town solicitor, who told her the filing had enough legal weight to cause serious trouble. Old Reverend Stokes, who prayed with her and meant it kindly but could not stop a court proceeding. Her neighbor, Bill Granger, who told her he was sorry, but that Marcus Bell had powerful friends in the county, and maybe it was time to think about settling. Settling. Clara closed the ledger and sat very still at the table for a long moment. Settling meant giving up the house where she was born. Giving up the pasture where her father taught her to ride before she was old enough to reach the stirrups properly. Giving up the creek that ran along the eastern fence line where she and Tommy used to catch crawdads on summer afternoons and pretend they were somewhere else. Somewhere with no debt and no worry and no roof that leaked every time it rained. Settling meant handing a piece of her family's history to a man who had never earned a single honest acre in his life. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark. Then she thought about Everett Hayes. She had never spoken more than a handful of words to him in her life. He was older than her 44. She'd heard a widower who had been managing his ranch alone since his wife passed 8 years back. People in town talked about him the way they talked about weather that comes from a direction you can't predict. Quiet, they said. Keeps to himself. Cold, some said. Though the ones who said it usually hadn't spent enough time around him to know the difference between cold and careful. What she knew about him was limited but specific. He had a reputation for honesty in all his business dealings, which was rare enough in this county to be noteworthy. His ranch was well managed and debt-free, which meant he had money, or at least the practical skills that kept money from disappearing. And 3 years ago, when Marcus Bell had tried to purchase a section of her family's eastern pasture through a middleman using what turned out to be a fraudulent contract, Everett Hayes had been the one to quietly bring the documentation to the county records office and flag the irregularity. He had never said a word to her about it. She had found out from the clerk who processed the flag. That was the thing that Clara kept coming back to. He had done the right thing without asking for anything in return, and without making sure anyone knew he'd done it. That kind of person was rare. That was the kind of person you could trust. She did not know if she could trust him with what she was about to ask. But she had run out of every other option, and if she was going to lose the ranch anyway, She was going to lose it, having tried everything she could think of. Even the things that seemed impossible. Even the things that made her hands shake. She got dressed in the dark, saddled her horse, and rode north. The wind came at her sideways the whole way, and she bent into it and kept going. She did not let herself think about what she was going to say until she was already standing on his porch. And then she thought about it very clearly for exactly 3 seconds before she knocked. She heard movement inside. She heard boots on floorboards. Then the door opened and Everett Hayes was standing there looking at her, the way a man looks when someone shows up at his door before sunrise, not angry, not alarmed, just waiting to understand what was happening. He was taller than she remembered from the few times she'd seen him at the feed store or the county fair. He had dark hair going silver at the temples and hands that looked like they had been doing serious work for a very long time. His expression was still, the way a lake goes still before a storm. "Clara Whitfield," he said. Not a question, an identification. "I know it's early," she said. "Come inside." She stepped into his kitchen. It was clean and spare and warm from a fire he'd clearly already started, which meant he'd been awake before she arrived. He gestured toward a chair at the table and moved to pour coffee without asking if she wanted any, which she did. She sat down and wrapped both hands around the mug he set in front of her and looked at it for a moment. "You know about the hearing," she said. "I heard. Then you know what Marcus Bell is claiming. I know what he's claiming. I also know what he's actually doing." Clara looked up. "What do you think he's actually doing?" Everett sat down across from her. Unhurried. "He's been circling your family's land for 6 years. He tried the middleman approach in the eastern pasture. That didn't work. He tried making a low offer through a bank representative 2 years ago, and your father refused. Your father died, and Bell saw the timing and decided this was his best window." He paused. "He's not doing this because of a legal technicality. The technicality is a tool. What he actually wants is to break you down fast enough that you don't have time to fight back properly." Clara stared at him. She had come here with a plan. She had practiced what she was going to say for 40 minutes on horseback. But sitting here, hearing him lay out the truth of her situation so plainly, and without any of the careful softening everyone else had wrapped it in, she felt the plan dissolve completely, and for one terrible second she thought she was going to cry. She had not cried in front of another person since her father's funeral. She was not going to cry now. She breathed once. Then she said it. "I need to get married before Friday." The kitchen went completely quiet. Everett's expression did not change. "Married," he said. "I've done the research," Clara said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "If I'm a married woman with a husband whose land holdings and financial standing are already on record in this county, it changes the weight of the claim Bell's lawyer is trying to make. It's not a guarantee, but it complicates his filing in 3 specific ways that my solicitor confirmed. It also gives me a co-petitioner for the counterfiling, which means the court has to schedule a full hearing instead of a summary ruling." She paused. "Which buys me time, and time is the one thing I don't have." Everett looked at her for a long moment. "You rode out here before sunrise," he said, "to ask me to marry you." "Yes. Why me?" She had expected that question. She had an answer ready. "Because you have a clean record in this county. Because your land is in order. Because 3 years ago you reported the irregularity in that eastern pasture contract without asking for anything in return and without telling me you'd done it." She held his gaze. "Because I think you're honest, and right now honest is the thing I need most." Another silence. Everett stood up and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her and his hands at his sides, looking out at the dark that was just starting to go gray at the edges. And Clara sat very still and waited. She did not rush him. She could feel how much was riding on the next 30 seconds, and she did not want to tip it in the wrong direction by pushing before he was ready. "How long?" he finally said. "How long for what? How long would you need this arrangement to hold?" Clara's heart was beating very fast, but her voice did not show it. long enough for the court matter to resolve, and for the deed to be formally secured in a way that Belle can't challenge. 6 months minimum. Possibly a year. He turned around. A year is a long time. I know. And at the end of it, we agree on terms before we start, Clara said. Whatever you decide you need, I'm not asking you to give me something for nothing. If there's land, or equipment, or I don't know what you need, but I'll figure out a way to make this fair for you. Everett looked at her for another long moment. Something moved across his expression that she couldn't read precisely. But it wasn't reluctance. It looked almost like she wasn't sure. Like recognition. You don't know me, he said. No. You don't know what kind of man I am to live with. No, she said again. I don't. But I know what kind of man you are when you think no one's watching. And that's usually the part that matters. He was quiet again. And then he said, yes. Clara heard the word, and her body went so still that for a moment she forgot to breathe. You don't even know what else I was going to say, she said. Everett looked at her steadily. I know enough. She opened her mouth and closed it again. She had prepared for negotiation. She had prepared for conditions and complications, and the kind of careful back and forth that practical arrangements required. She had not prepared for this, for a man who looked at the bare bones of a desperate situation and made a decision in the time it took her to exhale. Just like that, she said. Just like that, he confirmed. He moved back to the table and sat down and picked up his coffee cup like a man settling in to work through the practical matters. When does the paperwork need to be filed? And just like that, they were planning a wedding. It was not the kind of planning Clara had ever imagined for herself as a girl. There were no dresses or flowers or decisions about music. There was a list of documents they needed, a schedule for getting to the county clerk's office before it closed on Wednesday, a brief conversation about whether anyone needed to be told before it was official. Everett had a neighbor, a man named Henderson, who handled most of the large animal veterinary work in the area, who could serve as witness. Clara thought of asking Reverend Stokes, but decided she would rather keep the circle small until the court matter was resolved. People will talk, she said. People talk, regardless, Everett said. Usually about things that are none of their business. They'll say, I'm desperate. He looked at her. You were desperate. That doesn't mean you're wrong. She hadn't expected that either. The honesty of it. The absence of any attempt to soften or reframe what was plainly true. Does that bother you? She asked. Being married to someone who came to you out of desperation? Everett considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. No, he said, I've lived alone for 8 years. I know the difference between quiet and peace. Most of the time they're not the same thing. He paused. I'm not doing this out of pity. I want you to understand that. Then why are you doing it? He was quiet for a moment. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. Because what Belle is doing isn't right, he finally said. And I was raised by a man who believed that when you can stop something wrong from happening and you don't, that's its own kind of wrong. Clara sat with that for a moment. That's a lot of responsibility to take on for a stranger, she said. You're not a stranger, Everett said. I've known your family's reputation for 15 years. I know what your father built on that land, and I know what it cost him. He paused again. And I know what kind of person rides 40 minutes through that wind at 5 in the morning to fight for something they believe in. Clara looked at him. Really looked at him, maybe for the first time, past the deliberate composure and the careful economy of words, and she saw something there that she hadn't expected to find. Not warmth, exactly. Something quieter than warmth and more durable. She cleared her throat. All right, she said. Wednesday morning, then. Wednesday morning, he agreed. She stood to leave. He walked her to the door and held it open. And she stepped out into the gray early morning, and the wind had died down a little while they were inside. And she could see the first pale line of light starting along the eastern edge of the sky. One more thing, she said, turning back. What's that? I pay my debts. Whatever this costs you, time, reputation, anything, I will pay it back somehow. I don't know how yet, but I will. Everett looked at her for a moment with that same unreadable steadiness. I know you will, he said. She rode home with the wind at her back, and for the first time in 4 days she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It wasn't relief. It was something more complicated than relief. It was the feeling of a decision made that cannot be unmade. Of a door you've walked through, knowing you can't walk back through it the same way. She had asked a quiet stranger to marry her, and he had said yes. And in 72 hours her name would change, and her legal status would change, and everything Marcus Bell thought he had planned would become significantly more complicated. She was terrified. She was also, underneath the terror, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Ready. The next 2 days moved fast and slow at the same time. The way all days do when something enormous is coming. Clara handled the practical things, because practical things were what she was good at. She gathered the documents she needed: the deed, her father's will, the correspondence she'd saved from the original survey, every piece of paper that demonstrated the legitimacy of her family's claim. She met with her solicitor on Tuesday afternoon and told him what she'd arranged. He went very quiet for a moment and then said, carefully, that it was a creative approach and that the co-petitioner angle might give them the leverage they needed to push for a full hearing. It's not a guarantee, he said. I know, Clara said. But it's better than what I had yesterday. He agreed that it was better than what she'd had yesterday. She rode to Everett's ranch again Tuesday evening to go over the court documents together. She found him at the kitchen table with a lamp burning and a stack of papers she recognized as duplicates of the county filing. He had already read through them. He had notes in the margin in small, precise handwriting. You've seen these before, she said. I had Henderson pull the public record when the filing went through. I wanted to understand what Bell was actually claiming. He looked up. I think there's a problem with this section here. He turned the page toward her and pointed to a paragraph near the bottom. His lawyer is arguing that the original deed transfer wasn't properly witnessed. But the county record shows the signature of the justice of the peace who officiated it in Trotter in 1871. If that justice was still alive in 1871, and in good standing, he was, Clara said immediately. Judge Warren. He died in 1889. I found his obituary in my father's papers. Something changed in Everett's expression. Just slightly. You have the obituary. I have the obituary, and I have a letter he wrote to my grandfather confirming the land transfer was legitimate. I found it in the back of my mother's Bible 2 months ago when I was going through her things. Everett looked at her for a moment. That's significant. I know it's significant. I didn't know if my solicitor could get it into evidence in time for a summary ruling. But if we push for a full hearing, you can get it into evidence, Everett said. I'll talk to Henderson. He knows the county registrar personally. We can file a motion to introduce historical documentation before Friday, and the registrar will accept it. He paused. Bell doesn't know about that letter. No, Clara said. I haven't told anyone. I wasn't sure who to trust with it. Everett looked at her steadily. You can trust me with it. She knew that. She had known it since 5 o'clock that morning when he'd said yes without knowing the full picture. She took the letter out of her coat pocket. She'd been carrying it close to her body for 2 months. Too afraid to leave it anywhere, and set it on the table between them. He read it slowly and carefully. She watched his face while he read it. She had gotten reasonably good at reading people over the years. You had to be. When you were a young woman running a ranch and negotiating with men who frequently assumed they knew better, but Everett's face was harder to read than most. He kept things close. When he finished reading, he set the letter down and was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather knew what he was doing when he kept this, he said. He was careful, Clara said. He didn't have much formal education, but he understood that paper mattered. He kept everything. She paused. So did my father. The ledger goes back 40 years. Everett nodded slowly. Then he said, Bell is going to be angry when this falls apart on him. I know, not just disappointed. Angry in the kind of way that makes men do things they shouldn't. Clara met his eyes. I've been managing angry men, trying to take things from me since I was 23 years old. I'm not afraid of anger. Another of those moments that she was beginning to recognize where he looked at her in a way that wasn't exactly admiration, but was its own thing. Something more considered than admiration. No, he said. I don't suppose you are. They filed the motion the next morning. They got married in the county clerk's office at 2 in the afternoon on Wednesday, with Henderson and the clerk's deputy as witnesses. In a ceremony that lasted 11 minutes, Clara wore her best dress, which was practical rather than pretty. Everett wore a clean shirt and his good boots, and looked like a man attending a business meeting he was taking seriously. The clerk, a woman named Mrs. Denton, who had processed every significant legal event in this county for 22 years, gave them a look that was half curiosity and half assessment. "You two known each other long?" she asked, in the tone of someone who already suspected the answer. "Long enough," Everett said, which wasn't exactly an answer but wasn't exactly a lie. Mrs. Denton looked at Clara. Clara looked back at her steadily. "Is there anything else we need to sign?" Mrs. Denton decided this was not her business, which was the correct decision, and processed the paperwork efficiently. They walked out of the county clerk's office as husband and wife at 14 minutes past 2 on a Wednesday afternoon, and Clara stood on the sidewalk for a moment, squinting in the winter light and feeling the full strangeness of what had just happened. "Are you all right?" Everett asked. "I'm fine," she said. And then, because she had promised herself she would be honest with him, "I'm strange. It's a strange feeling." "Yes," he said simply. "It is." She looked at him. "You've been married before. Does it feel the same as the first time?" He considered that. "No," he said. "It doesn't feel the same." He paused. "It doesn't feel worse either. Just different." She nodded. That seemed like an honest answer. They rode back to his ranch because the practical decision they had made, and nearly every decision between them so far had been practical, was that she would move her essential things to the Hayes ranch before the hearing, so that when the court confirmed the marriage on record, everything was in order. Her cattle would stay on her land for now. Her ranch hand, a quiet 17-year-old named Pete who had nowhere else to go, would manage the daily work. She brought 2 saddlebags and a trunk. Everett helped her carry the trunk up to the room he'd prepared without being asked. It was the larger of the 2 spare bedrooms, facing east, with a window that looked out toward the distant ridge where the sunrise would hit first in the morning. She noticed that he had put a clean lamp on the bedside table, and there was a new bar of soap on the washstand. Small things, but she noticed. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and left her to settle in, and she stood in the room with her 2 saddlebags and her trunk and looked out the window at the ridge, going gold in the late afternoon light. She thought about her father. She thought about what he would have said if he could have seen her here. He would have been sorry it had come to this, but he also would have recognized the practicality of it. The stubbornness underneath the practicality, the refusal to go down without a fight. She heard the sound of Everett moving around in the kitchen below. The clatter of a pot, the low thud of a door. She unpacked her things and went downstairs. Thursday passed in a kind of concentrated intensity. The solicitor came in the morning to go over their counterfiling. He had filed the motion to introduce the historical documentation, and the registrar had accepted it. Marcus Bell's lawyer had apparently responded by requesting an emergency session with the judge to contest the motion, which the judge had declined. Clara could see on her solicitor's face that this was a good sign, though he was too careful to say so directly. In the afternoon, Everett quietly told her he had spoken to 2 other families in the county, the Mercers and the Delacroix, who had faced similar pressure from Bell-affiliated representatives over the past 3 years. Neither family had been able to stop the proceedings against them. One had settled at terms that amounted to selling their land for 1/3 of its value. The other was still fighting. "They'd be willing to speak to your solicitor," Everett said. Clara looked at him. "You talked to them about my situation." "I talked to them about Bell's pattern," he said carefully. I didn't tell them more than they needed to know. When did you do this? Yesterday morning. While you were at your ranch, getting your things. She was quiet for a moment. You didn't tell me you were going to do that. No, he said. I should have asked you first. I apologize. He said it plainly. Without defensiveness. Just a clean, straightforward acknowledgement. Clara had been apologized to before. She had rarely been apologized to like that without any softening or justification layered underneath it. Just, I was wrong, I'm sorry. It's all right, she said. It's actually very helpful. Thank you. He nodded. I'll let you take it from here with your solicitor. It's your fight. She heard that. She felt it. That night they ate supper together for the first time, and the strangeness of it was something neither of them tried to hide or talk around. They were two adults who had made a practical decision and were now living with the full weight of what practical decisions actually required when they involved sharing a kitchen and a table and the particular quiet intimacy of passing the salt. Everett cooked because he had been cooking for himself for 8 years and knew what he was doing. Clara washed up after because it was the fair exchange, and she was not a woman who needed to be asked to do her share. They talked a little, not about the case. They had been talking about the case all day. They talked about other things. She mentioned that her ranch hand Pete was 17 and had been orphaned at 14 and had been working for her father for 3 years. Everett said he remembered seeing a boy like that at the ranch once, thought he looked capable. Clara said he was more capable than he knew. Everett told her his ranch had originally belonged to his wife's family. Her parents had left it to them when they passed. After his wife died, he'd thought about selling. He hadn't been able to. He wasn't sure if that was grief or stubbornness or both. Clara said she thought sometimes they were the same thing. He looked at her like she'd said something that landed somewhere exact. After supper, they sat for a while in the room he used as a study, which had 2 chairs and more books than she'd expected him to have. And she went through her documents one more time while he read. It was oddly comfortable, the silence of it. She had been so alone with all of this for so long. Just being in the same room with another person who understood the stakes was something. She went to bed at 9 because the hearing was at 9 in the morning and she needed to sleep. And this time she actually slept. Not perfectly. Not without dreams that were half memory and half dread. But she slept. She woke at 5:30 to the sound of Everett already moving around below. And she lay in the unfamiliar room in the gray half-light and thought about her father, and her mother, and Tommy with his bare feet in the creek, and about the letter hidden in her mother's Bible for God knows how many years waiting for the right moment to matter. Then she got up and got dressed and went downstairs to face Friday. The kitchen was warm, and Everett had coffee ready. He handed her a cup without saying anything. She took it and stood at the counter, and they didn't talk for a few minutes, which felt right. Some mornings didn't need words. Then he said quietly, "Whatever happens in that room today, you've already done more than most people would have." She looked at him. "I'm not saying that to be kind," he said. "I'm saying it because it's accurate." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm listening to it." Something shifted in his expression. Just barely. The way a river surface shifts when the wind changes direction. They left for the county building at 7:30. The sky was pale and cold and enormous over the Wyoming plain. And Clara Whitfield, Clara Hayes now, though it still sounded strange to think it, rode beside her husband of 39 hours toward the hearing that would decide whether she kept the only home she had ever known. She was afraid. She was also more ready than she had ever been for anything in her life. And Marcus Bell had no idea what was waiting for him. The county building smelled like old wood and coal smoke and the particular kind of official anxiety that collects in places where people come to fight over things that matter. Clara walked in with Everett 2 steps behind her and her solicitor, a careful man named Aldridge, 2 steps ahead, and she felt the eyes before she saw whose they were. Marcus Bell was already there. He was standing near the far wall with his lawyer. a sharp-faced man from Cheyenne named Pratt, who wore suits that cost more than most ranchers made in a season. Bell himself was 60, heavy-set, with the kind of confident posture that came from decades of getting his way in rooms exactly like this one. He had silver hair and a politician's habit of smiling while he looked at you like he was deciding what you were worth. He saw Clara and smiled. He saw Everett and the smile changed. It was subtle enough that most people would have missed it. Clara didn't miss it. She had spent enough years reading the faces of men who wanted her land to recognize the exact moment when one of them recalculated. Aldridge leaned close to her. Bell's lawyer filed a second motion this morning to exclude the historical documentation. The judge hasn't ruled on it yet. Of course he did, Clara said quietly. If the judge excludes the letter, he won't, Clara said. She said it with more certainty than she felt, which was a skill she had learned early and used often. They took their seats on the left side of the room. Everett sat beside her without being asked, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching. She was aware of that closeness in a way that surprised her, not uncomfortable, but present, like a windbreak, like something solid between her and the open cold. The judge entered at 9:05. His name was Harlan, a man in his 60s who had been sitting county bench for 20 years and had the particular exhausted fairness of someone who had heard every variety of human grievance and was not easily impressed by any of them. He sat down, looked at the papers in front of him, looked at the room, and said, "Before we begin, I want to address the motion filed by the plaintiff this morning to exclude Exhibit C from the defendant's counterfiling." Motion denied. Pratt stood up immediately. "Your Honor, the document's provenance is documented in the county record." "Mr. Pratt, I've read it." Motion denied. The judge looked at him over the top of his glasses in a way that suggested the topic was finished. "Sit down." Pratt sat down. Clara exhaled very slowly through her nose. Beside her, Everett didn't move at all, but she felt something, a shift in the quality of his stillness. Like a man who had been holding something tight, releasing just a fraction of the tension. What followed was 2 hours of procedural argument that felt both agonizingly slow and unsettlingly fast, the way important things always do when you're in the middle of them. Pratt argued his case with the polished confidence of a man who believed the outcome was already decided. He used words like technical irregularity and chain of title deficiency and good faith acquisition in the particular way that lawyers use language to make straightforward theft sound like a regrettable administrative oversight. Aldridge countered methodically. He introduced the Judge Warren letter. He introduced the 40-year ledger, which he had marked with small paper tabs at every entry that demonstrated continuous, undisputed ownership. He introduced the testimony statements he had collected the previous day from the Mercer family and from the Delacroix daughter, who had driven in from 2 counties away that morning, specifically to give her account. Clara had not known the Delacroix daughter was coming in person. She glanced at Everett. He looked straight ahead at the front of the room. She looked back at the front of the room, too. When Aldridge called her to speak, Clara stood up and walked to the front of the room and turned to face Judge Harlan, and she was aware of Marcus Bell watching her from across the room with that same assessing smile. And she decided then that she was going to look at the judge, and only at the judge, because this was not a conversation with Marcus Bell. This was a conversation with the law, and she had things to say to it. She spoke for 12 minutes. She had not prepared a speech exactly, but she had been living with the facts of this case for long enough that they came out in the right order, cleanly, without hesitation. She talked about the original deed. She talked about Judge Warren and what his letter documented. She talked about the ledger and what 40 years of continuous record-keeping meant about the legitimacy of her family's claim. She talked about the Eastern pasture irregularity 3 years ago and what it demonstrated about the pattern of pressure her family had been subjected to. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She did not look at Marcus Bell. When she was finished, Judge Harlan made a note and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes, Mrs. Hayes." It was the first time anyone had called her that. It landed strangely, like hearing your name mispronounced, but in a way that was somehow more correct than the original. She walked back to her seat. Everett was watching her with that careful, contained expression. She sat down and he leaned slightly toward her and said, very quietly, good. Just that one word. But she felt it all the way down. Judge Harlan took a recess at 11:15. He returned at 11:50 and gave his ruling in the direct, unhurried way of a man who had made up his mind some time ago and was not interested in theater. The motion to invalidate the deed was denied. The counter-petition for formal title confirmation was granted. The county would conduct a full review of the chain of title, to be completed within 30 days, at the conclusion of which, barring any significant new evidence, which the judge noted he did not expect to emerge, the Whitfield property deed would be formally confirmed in perpetuity. Bell's scheme, 3 years in the making, had just been told no by a judge who looked bored doing it. The room stirred. Aldridge turned to Clara with an expression that was professionally composed but visibly relieved. She shook his hand and said thank you, and meant it absolutely. Behind her she could hear Pratt speaking in a low, urgent voice to Bell. And she did not turn around to look, because it was not necessary to see a man's face, when you already knew what defeat looked like on him. Everett was standing when she turned. He had stood when she stood, which she noticed. He was not smiling. He was not a man who smiled easily, but there was something in his face that was the equivalent of a smile, in the way that his steady quiet was sometimes the equivalent of warmth. Present, real. It's not over, she said, because it wasn't. 30 days of county review was 30 days of still not knowing for certain. Bell could file new challenges. Pratt could find angles that hadn't been tried yet. No, Everett agreed. But today was real, she nodded. Today was real. She held on to that. They were walking toward the exit when Marcus Bell moved to intercept them. He did it smoothly, the way he did everything, not aggressive enough to be called aggressive, not subtle enough to be ignored. He positioned himself just inside the doorway, so that declining to speak to him would have required a deliberate physical maneuver, which was exactly the kind of small power move he had clearly perfected over decades of doing this. Mrs. Hayes, he said pleasantly. The name sounded different coming out of his mouth. Slick with the wrong kind of meaning, like he was tasting it for weaknesses. Congratulations seemed to be in order. Clara stopped. She did not step back. Mr. Bell, I have to say. This was a creative approach. He glanced at Everett with the particular dismissiveness of a man who had decided Everett was an obstacle rather than a person. A recent marriage changes the character of a property dispute. Very clever. It changes the facts of the property dispute, Clara said, which were always in my favor. Bell's pleasant expression stayed exactly in place, which meant he was angry. When genuinely unconcerned men hear something unexpected, their expressions actually shift. Bell's was locked. The county review process is thorough, he said. 30 days leaves a lot of time for complications to arise. Are you threatening me? Clara said it calmly. The way you'd ask someone what time it was. I'm making an observation, Bell said. Then I'll make one back. She looked at him steadily. I know about the Mercers. I know about what happened to the Delacroix family's western pasture in 1882. I know about the Hollis property in Sheridan County. She watched his pleasant expression crack slightly at the edges. Just at the edges. I have documentation of a pattern, Mr. Bell, and I have people who are willing to speak to that pattern in a formal proceeding. She paused. So when you talk about complications arising in the next 30 days, I want you to understand that complications cut in more than one direction. Bell looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Everett. Everett looked back at him without any particular expression, which was somehow more threatening than hostility would have been. There was nothing for Bell to get purchase on, nothing to read, nothing to react to. Just a man standing next to his wife, watching you try to intimidate her and finding the whole thing mildly uninteresting. Bell looked back at Clara. Good day, Mrs. Hayes, he said. He walked out. Clara did not let herself exhale until the door had closed behind him. "The Hollis property," Everett said quietly. "I didn't tell you about that one." Henderson mentioned it when I asked him about other cases, Clara said. "I may have asked him more questions than you knew about." Everett looked at her with that barely there shift in expression. "When?" "Yesterday afternoon when you were out checking the east fence." A pause. "How much do you know?" "Enough to make that threat real," she said. "Not quite enough to make it stick in court yet, but enough to make him wonder." Everett was quiet for a moment. "Then, you're more dangerous than he thought." "Most people are," Clara said, when they finally stopped being polite about it. They walked out into the cold air together. And Clara Whitfield, Clara Hayes, she was still getting used to it, breathed in the sharp winter air, and felt the tightness in her chest loosen one more degree. Not all the way, not yet, but enough. Enough to think about the next 30 days, instead of just the next 30 minutes. The ride back was quiet, not an uncomfortable quiet. The way silences between people who don't know each other well can compress into something awkward and pressurized. This was the quiet of two people who had just gone through something significant together and were separately processing what it meant. Clara had learned early that it was possible to be comfortable with silence, and that this was actually a rarer quality than most people realized. Her father had been a quiet man. She had inherited it. Everett was quiet in a different way than her father had been. Her father's quiet was the quiet of someone who thought in long, slow loops, and was always slightly elsewhere, even when he was present. Everett's quiet was completely present. He wasn't somewhere else. He was entirely in the moment he was in, just not narrating it. She found this unexpectedly restful. They got back to the ranch in the early afternoon. Pete had ridden over to check on her cattle and left a note on Everett's door in his careful, slightly unpracticed handwriting. "All fine here. East water trough froze overnight, fixed it. Back tomorrow." Clara read the note twice. She thought about Pete, 17 and earnest, fixing a frozen water trough on his own without being asked. She had found him 3 years ago, sitting behind the feed store, eating a biscuit he'd clearly stolen, wearing boots that were 2 sizes too small, and had offered him a job that first turned into a bunk in the barn, and then into a more permanent arrangement that neither of them had ever formally described, but both clearly understood. "He's good," Everett said, reading over her shoulder. "He is," Clara said. "He doesn't know it yet. Most capable people don't." For a while, she looked at him. He had moved to hang up his coat, not looking at her when he said it, which she had started to notice was a pattern. He said things directly, but often when he was doing something else, as though the activity gave him a cover for the words that he might not have offered otherwise. She filed that away. It seemed important. They ate lunch, standing at the kitchen counter, because sitting down for a meal felt like too deliberate a thing after the morning they'd had. They had bread and cold meat and coffee, and Clara told him about the documentation she'd found on the Hollis property, which she'd asked Henderson about in more detail than she'd initially let on. Everett listened without interrupting, which was how he always listened, with a quality of attention that was entirely unfashionable and entirely real. When she finished, he said, "That's 4 properties, including yours. Bell's been running this same scheme across 3 counties over 12 years. That's what it looks like. That's not a man taking advantage of opportunities," Everett said. "That's a deliberate operation." "Yes," Clara said. "Which is why I told him I had documentation of a pattern. Because once it's a pattern in a legal proceeding, it stops being a civil matter and starts being something else." Everett was quiet for a moment. "Have you talked to Aldridge about this?" "I'm going to talk to him this week. I wanted to get through today first. You should talk to him soon, I know." A pause. "Do you want me to come with you?" She thought about that. The question was genuinely offered, not performed. He wasn't asking because he thought she needed him there. He was asking because he thought the option should exist. "Not yet," she said. "It's still my meeting, but I'll tell you what he says." He nodded. That was enough. The boundary was stated, respected, and they moved on. In the afternoon, Clara went out to check the fence line on the southern edge of Everett's property, partly because she needed to move her body after the morning's stillness, and partly because she needed to think without anyone watching her think. She had spent her whole adult life as the kind of woman who worked through difficult things by doing other things simultaneously, and a fence line was honest work that asked nothing of her except her hands and her attention. She found a section near the south gate where two posts had worked loose from the freeze and thaw cycle, leaning enough to put strain on the wire. She didn't have her tools with her. She stood there looking at it, measuring the problem. She heard boots behind her and turned. Everett was coming across the field with a post driver and a coil of wire. "I noticed it last week," he said. "Meant to get to it." He started working on the first post without any preamble, driving it back to vertical with the methodical efficiency of a man who had been doing this his entire life. Clara took the wire and moved to the next section, pulling the slack back into alignment without being asked to. They worked together for nearly an hour. They didn't talk much. When they needed to coordinate, they did, and when they didn't, they were quiet. And the quiet of working alongside someone toward a shared, practical goal was one of the most specific kinds of comfort that Clara knew. At some point, she became aware that this ordinary thing, fixing fence on a cold afternoon, was somehow easier with him than it had been with anyone else in a long time. Not because he was doing her share of the work. He wasn't. Because he wasn't interfering with her doing her own share. She had been surrounded by people who meant well and were exhausting. People who asked if she needed help before she'd had a chance to decide. People who watched her do things with a hovering concern that said they expected her to fail. Everett didn't hover. He just worked beside her. It was such a specific and unexpected relief that she almost said something about it. Then she decided not to. Some things were better understood than said. When they were done and walking back, he said, "The solicitor sent a message while you were out. He wants to meet Monday morning." "Did he say what about?" "Bell's lawyer made a call to his office this afternoon." Clara stopped walking. "What kind of call?" "The kind where they mentioned settlement." She turned to look at him fully. "Bell wants to settle. His lawyer is making preliminary noises in that direction," Everett said carefully. "Which means one of two things. He's scared," Clara said. "Or he's trying to get me to agree to terms before the 30-day review comes back and gives me more leverage." "Or both," Everett said. She thought about it. The cold air was sharp, and the light was going flat and gray in the way it did in the late afternoon of a Wyoming winter. And she stood in it, thinking about Marcus Bell making phone calls to her solicitor on the same day a judge had just denied his motion. "He's scared," she said finally. "If he was purely strategic about it, he'd wait. He'd let the 30 days play out and then approach from a position of partial information. Moving now means something spooked him." Everett looked at her with that expression she was beginning to be able to read. The one that meant he had an opinion and was deciding whether to offer it. "Say it," she said. "It was what you said to him in the doorway," he said. "You told him you knew about the pattern. He doesn't know how much you actually know. And a man who's been running the same scheme across multiple counties for 12 years has a lot to lose if someone starts formally documenting it." Clara nodded, slowly. "So I scared him." "You scared him," Everett confirmed. "With information you mostly extrapolated." "Mostly," she said. "Not entirely." "No," he said, "not entirely. But enough that he can't calculate his risk accurately. Which is worse for him than knowing the exact number." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "My father-in-law was a cattle buyer for 30 years, he said. "He used to say that uncertainty is the most expensive thing you can sell a man." Clara thought about that. "Your father-in-law sounds like he was smart." "He was the smartest businessman I ever knew," Everett said. "Also one of the most honest. He used to say those two things weren't in conflict as often as people believed." "What happened to him?" "Died 4 years after Margaret." A pause. "She was his only child. He didn't much see the point of things after she was gone." Clara heard the weight underneath those words. The particular gravity of a loss described in plain language rather than adorned language, which was how the worst losses usually came out. "I'm sorry," she said. "Thank you," he said, in the straightforward way he accepted things. Not deflecting it, not elaborating on it, just receiving it. They walked the rest of the way back in a silence that was different from the earlier silence, heavier. Older, the way silence gets when it carries something real. That evening after supper, Clara sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to the Mercer family and one to the Delacroix daughter, thanking them for their testimony and telling them carefully, because she was not a lawyer and did not want to overstate what she knew, that she believed their cases might be worth revisiting if the county review confirmed what she suspected about Bell's pattern. She wrote both letters twice, discarding the first drafts because they were either too cautious or too bold. Everett came through the kitchen at some point and glanced at the letters without commenting. A few minutes later he set a cup of coffee beside her, which she hadn't asked for and which she appreciated very specifically. The way you appreciate a thing that's offered without any demand that you acknowledge the offering. She finished the letters. She folded them. She sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," he said. From the other room, she turned in her chair. He was in the doorway, leaning against the frame, holding his own coffee. "When I came to your door and asked you to marry me," she said, "what did you actually think? Not what you decided. What you actually thought in the first 10 seconds. He looked at her steadily for a moment. She had the sense that he was being precise, going back to find the exact thing she was asking for rather than a polished version of it. "I thought," he said slowly, "that you were the bravest person I'd seen come to my door in 8 years. He paused. "And then I thought that if someone like you was willing to come to someone like me, the situation must be serious enough that I should stop thinking about myself and start thinking about what could actually be done." Clara looked at him. "And then you just decided." "And then I decided, that fast. When you've been alone long enough," he said, "you get past the part where you need a long time to decide things. You already know what you think. You just have to catch up to it." She was quiet for a moment. "What did you think you knew?" Another of those careful pauses, where he actually went back and found the thing rather than saying a convenient nearby thing. "That Bell had been going after your family for years," he said. "That you'd been fighting him alone since your father died. That you were good enough at it to still be standing. And that the one thing you actually needed wasn't a rescuer. It was a shield, just enough cover to buy the time your evidence deserved." He paused one more time. "And that someone who understood those things clearly enough to ask for exactly what she needed instead of something else was someone I could work with." Clara felt something happen in her chest. Not dramatic, not like anything she would have used a large word for. Just a small, specific shift, like a lock turning that hadn't been turned in a long time. She looked back down at the folded letters. "That's a very sensible reason to get married," she said. "I'm a sensible man," he said, and then after a beat, "mostly." It was the first time she'd heard anything approaching lightness in his voice. It was slight enough that she might have imagined it. She didn't think she had. Mostly, she agreed. She sealed the letters. Upstairs, in the room that was learning to be hers, the lamp was burning and the night outside was very quiet. And somewhere out on the plain a horse shifted in its stall. And Clara Hayes sat at someone else's kitchen table in a house that was starting to feel less like a stranger's, and thought that she had no idea what the next 30 days would bring. But for the first time, in as long as she could remember, she was not thinking about them alone. The Monday meeting with Aldridge changed everything. Clara had walked in expecting to hear about Bell's settlement offer in the careful, hedged language that lawyers used when they wanted you to consider something without appearing to recommend it. She had prepared herself for that conversation, the quiet pressure, the reasonable-sounding numbers, the way defeat could be dressed up as pragmatism when someone presented it correctly. What she had not prepared for was Aldridge setting a folder on the desk between them, opening it, and saying, "Before we discuss Bell's inquiry, I need to show you something that came through the county registrar's office Friday afternoon." After the hearing, Clara looked at the papers. Everett, sitting beside her, leaned forward slightly. "What is it?" she asked. "It's a second deed," Aldridge said, "filed in 1879, claiming that a portion of your family's north pasture, approximately 40 acres, was sold to a third party before your grandfather completed the original purchase. The seller is listed as your grandfather himself." The room went very still. "That's not possible," Clara said. "Your grandfather was alive in 1879, Aldridge said carefully. "My grandfather never sold that pasture. He couldn't have. We've been running cattle on that land for 30 years without a single boundary dispute." She looked at the document. She looked at the signature at the bottom. She stared at it. "That's not his handwriting." "You're certain?" "I have 40 years of ledger entries in his handwriting." "Yes, I'm certain." She looked at Aldridge directly. "That document is forged." Aldridge nodded slowly. "That was my assessment as well, which creates a significant problem and a significant opportunity simultaneously. Because if it's forged," Everett said quietly, "then someone filed a forged legal document with the county registrar." "Filed on Friday afternoon," Aldridge said. After the hearing, after Bell's motion was denied, Clara sat back in her chair. Friday afternoon, while she and Everett had been riding home, while she'd been standing in the cold feeling the first loosening of a tension she'd been carrying for months. Bell had gone directly from the courthouse or sent someone directly from the courthouse to file a forged deed with the county registrar. "He panicked," Everett said. "He panicked," Clara confirmed. Her voice was calm. Her hands, under the table where no one could see them, were not. "He lost the first motion and he panicked, and he filed something he should have filed months ago if he was going to file it at all. Because now it's going to look like exactly what it is. Retaliation, fabrication. It does look like that," Aldridge said. "Which is why I called you here before we respond to the settlement inquiry. Because your response to that inquiry is now significantly different than it would have been Friday morning." "I'm not settling," Clara said. "I wouldn't advise it," Aldridge said. "If this document is forged, and I believe it is, then what Bell has just done is commit fraud against the county court. That is a criminal matter, not a civil one." The word criminal sat in the room with them for a moment. Clara thought about the Mercer family. She thought about the Delacroix daughter driving 2 counties to testify. She thought about the Hollis property and whatever other properties she hadn't found yet, out there in the record somewhere waiting to be named. "I want to pursue it," she said. "Clara." Aldridge spoke carefully. "Criminal proceedings take time. They require evidence to a higher standard. Bell has resources and connections in this county that—" "I know what Bell has," she said. "And now I have a forged document that he filed in a panic on the same afternoon a judge denied his motion. That's not a coincidence. That's a man who didn't think clearly when things stopped going his way." She looked at Aldridge steadily. "I want to pursue it." Aldridge looked at Everett. The way people sometimes looked at a woman's husband when they wanted a second opinion on a woman's decision. Everett looked back at him without offering one. Aldridge looked back at Clara. "All right," he said. "Then we need a handwriting expert. And we need to trace the chain of custody for that document. Who filed it? Who handled it? Who can be placed in the registrar's office Friday afternoon?" "Henderson knows the registrar," Everett said. It was the first thing he'd said to Aldridge directly. "He's known him for 20 years. The registrar will remember who came in that afternoon." Aldridge made a note. "Can you make that introduction?" "Today if you need it," Everett said. Clara looked at him. He caught her looking and held her gaze for a moment. Steady and quiet. And she felt that again, that specific thing she had no clean word for yet. The thing that was more than gratitude and less than what she was not quite ready to name. She looked back at Aldridge. "What do we do first?" They spent 2 hours in that office mapping out the next steps. When they left, Clara's mind was running fast and clear the way it only did when she had a direction. When the problem had shape and the shape had a plan attached to it. She had learned early that uncertainty was what undid her. Difficulty she could manage. Difficulty with a plan was almost welcome. Everett was quiet on the ride back. Not the resting quiet. The thinking kind, which she was also learning to read. "What is it?" she asked. "I'm thinking about who filed that document," he said. Bell's lawyer. "Pratt is too careful for this," Everett said. This was sloppy. Filed the same afternoon as the ruling. At the end of the business day, with a forged signature on a document that anyone who knew your grandfather's handwriting would catch immediately. He paused. Pratt would have waited. He would have let things cool down and then introduced it weeks later in a way that was harder to trace back to the hearing. This felt like someone who was told to do it quickly and did it wrong. Clara thought about that. Bell told someone else to do it. That's what I think. Which means there's a person who walked into the registrar's office Friday afternoon with a forged document and filed it. She paused. A person who is not Marcus Bell and not Pratt, who can be identified, and who will have to decide whether to protect Bell or protect themselves when this unravels. Everett looked at her. Yes, he created a witness against himself, Clara said. People do that when they're scared, Everett said. They stop thinking about the second and third step and just try to fix the immediate problem. She nodded slowly. The immediate problem Bell had been trying to fix was the sudden strength of her position after the hearing. And in trying to fix it, he had handed her something she hadn't had before. A criminal act that could be traced, documented, and prosecuted. She almost felt sorry for him, almost. They got back to the ranch in the early afternoon to find Pete's horse tied at the post outside the barn, which was unusual for a Monday. Clara swung down and went inside and found Pete sitting on a feed bucket with his hat in his hands, which was the way he sat when he had something to say that he was not sure how to say. "What happened?" she said. "Man came by your place this morning," Pete said. "While I was doing the morning feed. Said he was from the county assessor's office." He looked up at her. "He wasn't." Clara went still. "How do you know?" "Because I know the county assessor's men. I've seen them come out before when your father disputed the grazing boundary in 1881. They carry a specific kind of satchel and they always have two men together." Pete's jaw was set in the particular way of someone who was angry but keeping it contained. This man was alone. He had a different kind of bag. And he asked me, "Where you kept the original deed paperwork?" "What did you tell him?" "I told him, you kept everything at the lawyer's office," Pete said. "Which is what I figured you'd want me to say." Clara looked at this 17-year-old boy sitting on a bucket with his hat in his hands, who had the presence of mind to think fast and lie well, and then come directly to tell her about it. "Pete," she said, "Ma'am, you did exactly right." Something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly. More like a confirmation of something he'd hoped was true but wasn't sure of. "Did he look through anything while he was there?" she asked. "I watched him the whole time," Pete said. "He didn't go in the house." "I didn't let him." "You didn't let him," Clara repeated. "I told him. Mrs. Hayes didn't allow anyone in the house without a written order from the county office," Pete said. He pushed back a little, and I said I'd have to ask him to leave the property while I sent a message to confirm his credentials. His chin went up slightly. He left. Behind her, Everett made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to a single quiet exhale that contained something genuinely appreciative. "Go get something to eat in the kitchen," Clara told Pete. "You're staying for supper." Pete stood up and put his hat back on, and the relief on his face was complete and unguarded. The way relief only looks on someone who is still young enough not to know they should hide it. After he went inside, Clara turned to Everett. "Bell sent someone to find the deed," she said. "Or to see what else you had," Everett said. "The forgery was filed Friday. By Monday, he's already sending someone to your property." "He's not slowing down." "No," Clara said. "He's escalating." The realization of it was cold and specific. Bell had lost the hearing. Bell had filed a forged document in a panic. And now, instead of pulling back to reassess, he was pushing harder. That was either the behavior of a man who had more plays left than she knew about, or the behavior of a man who had committed to pull back and was now in a kind of forward momentum that panic had set in motion. She thought about what Everett had said about his father-in-law. Uncertainty is the most expensive thing you can sell a man. Belle was spending fast now, spending resources, spending risk, spending patience, and men who spent fast made mistakes. She was counting on that. That evening, she sat down with Everett and Pete at the kitchen table. Pete had accepted the supper invitation with the particular dignity of someone who had learned not to accept things too eagerly, and they talked through what Clara was beginning to think of as the fuller picture. Not just the court matter, the pattern, the 12 years of it, the 3 counties, the families, the amounts. Pete, who was younger than all of this but sharper than his years, asked a question that stopped Clara completely. Who owns the land after Belle buys it, he said. Does he keep it or does he sell it to someone else? Clara and Everett looked at each other. I don't know, Clara said slowly. I assumed he was accumulating land. Henderson mentioned something, Everett said, and then stopped. He was very still for a moment. He mentioned something last week that I didn't put together until just now. He looked at Clara. There's a railroad survey through this part of Wyoming. Northern route. It was commissioned quietly 2 years ago. Clara felt the hair on the back of her arms stand up. If a railroad line comes through here, she said, then the land it comes through becomes worth 10 times what it is right now, Everett said. Minimum, more in some places. And Belle has been buying up that land for 12 years, Clara said. Or stealing it, at current ranch prices, from families who had no idea what it was going to be worth. The kitchen was very quiet. That's not just fraud, Clara said. That's enormous. That's not one man cheating one family out of a property. That's a systematic. She stopped. How many properties do you think he has? I don't know, Everett said. But Henderson would know someone who might. We need to know before we talk to Aldridge again, Clara said. Because if this is what I think it is, what Belle filed on Friday is the smallest part of the problem. Pete was looking between them with the expression of someone who had asked an innocent question and inadvertently pulled a loose thread that was attached to something much larger than he expected. Did I make it worse? He asked. You made it bigger, Clara said. That's different. She was at Aldridge's office. First thing Tuesday morning, with Everett and with the new theory. Aldridge listened to all of it without interrupting, which was how she knew he was taking it seriously. He was the kind of man who interrupted when he thought he had a correction to offer, and he had none. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. If the railroad survey passes through the properties Belle has been acquiring, he said, then this becomes a matter of significant public interest, which means it potentially involves people in this county who are not Marcus Bell. Clara had not yet thought that far. You mean people who knew about the survey? The survey was commissioned quietly, Aldridge said. But someone commissioned it, and someone in the county government would have had access to the preliminary route information before it was made public. He paused. If any of those people have connections to Bell, then this goes higher than Bell, Everett said. Aldridge nodded slowly, reluctantly, like a man acknowledging a truth he would have preferred to find elsewhere. Clara leaned forward in her chair, which is why Bell is escalating instead of retreating. If we keep pulling this thread, it doesn't just expose him. It exposes whoever is above him or beside him, Aldridge said. We don't know the structure yet. No, Clara said. But we need to know it before they know we're looking. She thought for a moment. How quickly can we get the handwriting analysis on the forged deed? I know a man in Laramie. A week, possibly 10 days. And the registrar who came in Friday. I spoke to him yesterday afternoon. He remembers a man he didn't recognize. Young, well-dressed, nervous, paid the filing fee in cash. Aldridge paused. He also said the man made a comment about working for a Denver law firm. Denver. Not Cheyenne, where Pratt was based. Clara looked at Everett. He was already looking at her. Belle has a second lawyer, she said. Someone who doesn't have any connection to the local proceeding. Someone clean. Someone who he trusted to do the filing quickly and quietly, Everett said. Except the registrar remembered him. People always remember the nervous ones, Clara said. She spent the rest of Tuesday in a state of focused intensity that she recognized from the best days of managing the ranch, the days when the problems were real and the solutions were findable if you kept your head and your eyes open and moved fast enough. She wrote down everything she knew, everything she suspected, and everything she needed to confirm, in 3 separate columns in the back of her ledger, in handwriting small enough that it would require effort for anyone else to read. She was still at the table at 10 o'clock that night when Everett came in from checking the horses and stopped in the doorway and looked at her. "You should sleep," he said. "I know," she said, and didn't move. He came in, poured 2 cups of coffee, and set one in front of her without comment. Then he sat down across from her and picked up the document she'd been cross-referencing and read it without asking permission, which she didn't mind because she had stopped thinking of her documents as private from him somewhere around Saturday. "The Hollis property is in Sheridan County," he said. "That's a different county registrar, I know. But if the railroad route runs through Sheridan County too, the same records would show Belle's acquisitions there. I've been thinking about that. Henderson's cousin works in the Sheridan County assessor's office," Everett said. Clara looked up. "He does." "Yes. And he could access the property transfer records. If someone asked him the right way," Everett said. "Which Henderson could do." Clara looked at him across the table. This man who had said yes to a stranger at his door before sunrise. Who had introduced her to no one and claimed no credit for anything. Who brought coffee at 10 o'clock and read documents sideways and mentioned casually that his neighbor's cousin worked in exactly the office she needed. "You've been thinking about this since yesterday," she said. "Since this morning," he said. "When were you going to tell me?" "When you stopped writing long enough to listen," he said. She almost laughed. It came out as something smaller. A brief, real exhale of something that wasn't amusement exactly, but was related to it. "I'll talk to Henderson tomorrow," Everett said. "We'll talk to Henderson tomorrow," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "We," he said, and it was not a question. "We," she said firmly. He nodded. Something settled in his expression, not satisfaction exactly, but the quality of a thing fitting correctly into its place. They sat at the table for another hour, going through the documents together, and Clara noticed at some point that the way they worked through problems together had a rhythm to it that felt older than a week. That felt, if she was being precise about it, like something she had always done this way, and was only now remembering. She didn't examine that too carefully. There was too much else to think about, but she did not forget it. Wednesday arrived with a different kind of pressure. Henderson came to the ranch in the morning and listened to the full account of the railroad theory with the expression of a man who was recalibrating everything he thought he knew about a situation. He was a big, straightforward man who did not have a complicated relationship with truth, and when Clara finished laying out the shape of the thing, he sat back in his chair and said, "Well, that's a hell of a thing, yes," Clara said. "My cousin in Sheridan." He rubbed the back of his neck. "He's careful. He won't give access to official records informally." "I'm not asking for unofficial access," Clara said. "I'm asking for a formal records request through Aldridge's office. If your cousin can confirm, the request will be processed quickly and completely." Henderson looked at her. "That's a fair distinction, I know," she said. "I'll talk to him today," Henderson said. He paused. "Clara, how deep do you think this goes?" She thought about the question honestly. "I think it goes deep enough that Marcus Bell is scared of something bigger than a county court ruling. And I think the forged deed proves it, because a careful man doesn't do something that's sloppy, unless something larger is making him desperate." Henderson nodded, slowly. He looked at Everett. "You married an interesting woman." "I know that," Everett said simply. Henderson left. Clara stood in the kitchen after the door closed and felt the specific weight of a situation that had started as a fight for one family's land and had grown, in the space of 5 days, into something that implicated a railroad, multiple counties, and people she hadn't yet identified. She was not afraid. Not exactly. But she was aware, in a way she had not been before, that what she was doing now had moved past protecting her own land and into something larger. Something that would not be undone quietly regardless of how it ended. She thought about her father, about the way he had always said that some fights chose you before you got a chance to choose them. She put the coffee cups in the basin, squared her shoulders, and went to write her letter to Aldridge. By the time she sealed it, she had made a decision she had not quite made explicitly before, though the shape of it had been forming in her chest since Monday morning. She was not going to accept a settlement from Marcus Bell. She was not going to take the safe version of this. She was going to follow the thread wherever it went, for as long as it took, and she was going to bring as much of it into the light as the law would allow. Whatever the cost, whatever it meant for the next year of her life. Whatever it meant for the marriage she had entered for practical reasons and was now living inside of in ways that were becoming less and less practical by the day. She thought about that last part only briefly, then she put it away. There was too much work to do, but she did not forget it. And in the quiet part of her, the part that had been afraid for so long and was slowly, carefully learning to be something other than afraid, she knew that she wouldn't. The letter from Aldridge arrived on Thursday morning, and Clara knew from the weight of it, before she opened it, that something significant had changed. She was right. Henderson's cousin in Sheridan County had processed the formal records request with a speed that suggested he understood the gravity of what was being asked. The transfer records from Sheridan County showed 7 properties acquired by Bell-affiliated entities over a 14-year period. 3 of those transfers bore the same irregularities as the Eastern Pasture attempt on Clara's land middlemen. Fraudulent contracts, pressure applied at moments of family vulnerability. 2 had been sold within 18 months of acquisition to a holding company registered in Denver, a Denver holding company, the same city the nervous young man had mentioned when he forged a deed at the county registrar. Clara sat at the kitchen table with the letter and read it 3 times. Then she set it down and called for Everett, who was out back and came in still pulling off his work gloves. And she handed him the letter without saying anything and watched him read it. He read it once, steadily, without changing expression. Then he set it on the table between them and said, "Denver." "Denver," she confirmed. "The holding company has a name? Aldridge is running it down." "He has a contact at the Territorial Land Office." She paused. "Everett. If this holding company has been receiving Bell's acquisitions and reselling them at railroad corridor value, then Bell is not the top of this," Everett said. "He's the mechanism," Clara said. "Someone in Denver or multiple people identified the railroad route, identified the properties that would increase in value, and set Bell to work acquiring them through whatever means he could manage." She exhaled. "He's been their man in Wyoming, their operator on the ground." Everett was quiet for a moment. "Turning this over, which means when we went after Bell, we didn't just threaten him. We threatened whoever is behind him." The room felt different after he said that. Smaller and more serious. "Yes," Clara said. "And those people have considerably more resources than Bell does." "Yes." He looked at her directly. "Clara, this is not the same fight you started last week. I know that. The man who came to your ranch Monday, the one Pete turned away. That wasn't Bell being sloppy. That was someone testing what you have and how well you're protecting it." She had already thought about this, lying awake the night before. She had turned it over from every angle she could find and arrived at the same place each time. "I know," she said, "and I'm not going to pretend that doesn't concern me. But you're not going to stop?" "No." He held her gaze for a long moment. She waited for the hesitation, for the careful, reasonable suggestion that perhaps she had done enough, that perhaps the smart thing was to secure her land and let the larger matter go. It was what most people would have said. It was arguably what a sensible person would have said. What Everett said to was, "Then we need to be smarter about who knows what we know." And when, she felt something release in her chest. Yes, exactly. Aldridge needs to be careful about who he's asking questions of in Denver. If the holding company has legal connections in the territorial government, he knows that, Clara said. He mentioned it in the letter. He's using his contact at the land office quietly. Through a personal channel, not an official request. Good. Everett pulled out a chair and sat down with the particular intention of a man settling in to work. What do we know about the railroad survey itself? Who commissioned it? The Northern Pacific has been looking at Wyoming routes for 3 years. But there are also private investors who commission their own surveys before the railroad makes any official announcements. So they can acquire corridor land before prices rise. So this might not even be sanctioned by the railroad company, Everett said. Private investors, using advanced knowledge of a probable route, using a man like Bell to do the acquiring, Clara said. Quietly, through fraudulent deeds and forged documents and pressure applied to families who are already struggling. They sat with that for a moment. The full shape of it was ugly in a way that was clarifying rather than paralyzing. Clara had grown up understanding that greed made people do terrible things to other people. What she hadn't fully understood until this week was the scale at which organized greed could operate, the careful, systematic way it could move through a landscape, harvesting other people's lives with the precision of a machine that never had to look at the people it was grinding. The Mercers lost their south pasture for $800, she said. In 1882. If the railroad route runs through it, that land is worth 30 times that. Minimum. Everett said nothing. He didn't need to. I want them to get it back, Clara said. Not just me. All of them. He looked at her steadily. That's a much longer fight than 30 days, I know. A pause. I'm not saying don't do it. I know that too. He nodded once. All right. Then let's think about what we need. That conversation lasted 2 hours and produced a list that was simultaneously daunting and clarifying. They needed the full scope of Bell's acquisitions across all 3 counties. They needed the Denver Holding Company's ownership structure. They needed to confirm the railroad survey route and establish whether it overlapped with Bell's acquisition pattern. And they needed all of this before Bell, or whoever was directing him, realized the full scope of what Clara had assembled, because once they understood it, the pressure on her would increase in ways she needed to be prepared for. She was under no illusions about the danger, but danger that had a shape was manageable. It was the shapeless kind that destroyed people. On Friday, 10 days after the county hearing, Aldridge came to the ranch himself rather than sending a letter. That alone told Clara the news was significant enough that he didn't want it committed to paper. He sat at the kitchen table with coffee Clara poured and Everett across from him and a folder he placed face down on the table, which was the kind of dramatic gesture she would have expected from a less careful man, but which, from Aldridge, meant the contents were serious enough that he wanted to control exactly when she saw them. The Denver Holding Company, he said, is called Mountain Corridor Land Associates. It was incorporated 6 years ago. The registered principals are 3 names I didn't recognize. He paused. But the legal agent of record for the incorporations is a firm called Chetworth and Mills. He looked at her to see if the name meant anything. It didn't. She shook her head slightly. Chetworth and Mills represents a significant portion of the private investors who have been positioning for Wyoming land over the past 5 years, Aldridge said. They also, and this is the part that matters, represent the interests of Commissioner Harold Dean. Clara went completely still. Commissioner Harold Dean was the senior county land commissioner for the Wyoming Territory. He had held the position for 11 years. He attended every county fair, every civic function, every important social occasion, with the comfortable authority of a man whose position was considered permanent. Clara had shaken his hand at her father's funeral. Dean, Everett said, is listed nowhere in the Mountain Corridor documents, Aldridge said quickly. I want to be precise about this. His name does not appear, but his legal firm does, and his legal firm's representation of both the holding company and Commissioner Dean creates a connection that is, at minimum, a profound conflict of interest. He would have had access to the preliminary railroad survey, Clara said. Her voice came out very level, before anyone else. As county commissioner, yes, Aldridge said, he knew which land would be valuable. He or someone connected to him identified the corridor, and Bell was the instrument for acquiring it. That is the hypothesis, Aldridge said carefully. It is not yet proven, but it's what the evidence points to. It is what the evidence currently suggests, Aldridge said. Which is why I came in person. Because if this hypothesis is correct, then the county judge who ruled in your favor last week sits 2 rungs below Commissioner Dean in the territorial administration. Clara heard what he was not saying. You think the ruling could be reversed. I think that if the people above Bell understand what we've assembled, they will use every available tool to neutralize it. And some of those tools involve the legal system itself. He paused. I am not saying this to frighten you. You're saying it to prepare me, Clara said. Yes, she looked at Everett. He was watching her with that still, focused attention, not trying to interpret her reaction for her. Just present in it with her, waiting for her to land on what she actually thought. She thought, they are bigger than I knew. She thought, it doesn't matter. She thought, my grandfather held onto a letter for 50 years, and my mother kept it in her Bible, and I carried it in my coat pocket for 2 months, without knowing exactly why. And all of that patient, stubborn preservation was pointing at this moment. What do we need to do to make the evidence unassailable? She asked. Aldridge blinked. He had clearly expected a different first response. We need to establish the chain between Bell and Mountain Corridor in documented form. Property transfer records with timestamps, financial records if accessible. And we need to file the criminal complaint regarding the forged deed before any counter motion can be made against our title confirmation. The handwriting analysis, Everett said. Expected from Laramie on Monday, Aldridge said. That's our first anchor, Clara said. File the criminal complaint the moment the analysis confirms forgery. Don't wait. Don't discuss it with anyone outside this room before it's filed. She looked at Aldridge. Can you file on Monday if the analysis confirms what we think? If I prepare the filing now? Yes. Then prepare it now. Aldridge looked at her for another moment with the expression of a man reassessing something he thought he had already correctly assessed. Then he opened his folder and took out a pen. They worked through the afternoon. By the time Aldridge left at 4 o'clock, the criminal complaint was drafted. The evidence appendix was organized, and Clara had a list of 7 specific records she needed from the Sheridan County assessor to complete the property transfer chain. Everett had already sent a message to Henderson about his cousin before Aldridge's horse was out of the yard. That evening, Pete came by with news that stopped Clara cold. He had been in town to pick up supplies and had heard at the feed store the way you heard everything important in a small town. Through the incidental eavesdropping that happened when men thought no one notable was within earshot that Marcus Bell had held a meeting at the hotel the previous evening. A private dinner. The guests included 2 men Pete didn't recognize, and Pete said carefully, watching Clara's face as he said it. The county commissioner's secretary, Dean's secretary. At a private dinner with Bell, the night after Aldridge made his first inquiries at the Territorial Land Office. Someone told them, Clara said, or they're careful enough to monitor their exposure, and they notice the inquiry on their own, Everett said. Either way, they know we're looking at the larger picture. She turned to Pete. Did anyone see you at the feed store during this conversation? The man talking didn't know I was there, Pete said. I was in the back checking the grain sacks. He was talking to the counterman. You're sure he didn't see you? Pete met her eyes. I'm sure. She believed him. Pete had a particular quality of stillness when he needed to be unnoticed, a talent born. She suspected, from years of surviving situations where being noticed had consequences. Go home and don't mention this to anyone, she said. And Pete, don't go into town alone for the next week. He started to argue, and she held up a hand. I'm not asking because I think you can't handle yourself. I'm asking because I need you focused on the ranch, and I can't afford to have information about my movements getting back to people who are watching. She held his gaze. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am, he said, and this time he didn't argue. After Pete left, Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment, with her hands pressed flat against the table, feeling the full weight of the thing. They had moved from a county court dispute to a forged document to a Denver holding company to a county commissioner's secretary at a private dinner with Marcus Bell. All in 10 days. The speed of it was vertiginous. They're coordinating a response, she said. Yes, Everett said, which means we're on a clock now. Whatever we're going to file, we have to file before they do. Monday, he said. The moment Aldridge has the handwriting analysis. And between now and Monday? He was quiet for a moment. Then we keep everything here. Nothing goes through town. Nothing through people we don't know completely. He paused. I want to move the original documents, the Judge Warren letter, the ledger. Somewhere Bell's people won't look even if they come back to either property. Where? He thought for a moment. There's a place, he said. Henderson's root cellar. On the far side of his property, away from the main house. Nobody knows about it except Henderson himself and 2 men who've been working that land for 20 years. Clara looked at him. You trust Henderson completely. With my life, Everett said simply. I've trusted him with considerably less important things than that for 20 years. She nodded. Tomorrow morning, he agreed. They were quiet for a moment. The house was still around them. The particular stillness of a winter evening when the work was inside now and the dark outside was complete. Clara, Everett said. She looked at him. When this is over, he stopped. Start it again. When this is resolved. The 30 days. The criminal filing. All of it. What do you want? She wasn't sure what she'd expected him to ask. But it wasn't that. She looked at him steadily, trying to understand the full shape of the question. What do you mean? I mean, he paused in the particular way he paused when he was being precise rather than evasive. We made an arrangement, practical terms. 6 months. Possibly a year. You've never said what you want the end of it to look like. The question sat between them in the quiet kitchen. Larger than it sounded. I haven't thought that far ahead, she said. Which was partly true. The rest of the truth was that she had started to think about it and then deliberately stopped herself. Because it felt like a luxury she hadn't earned yet. Like spending money before the harvest was in. You should start, Everett said. Not unkindly. Not with any particular pressure behind it. Just the plain observation of a man who thought ahead. Should I, she said. I think so, he said. And then, after a pause that she felt all the way through, I've started. Clara looked at him for a long moment. The lamp on the table was between them, and it made the planes of his face different from the daylight. Softer in some ways and sharper in others, and she thought about the first morning she'd stood on this porch in the dark and asked a stranger to make her his wife, and how impossibly far away that morning felt from this one. What did you decide? She asked. He held her gaze. That I'd rather keep having supper with you than not. It was such a quiet thing to say. Such a quiet, specific, entirely serious thing. Not a declaration designed to overwhelm. Just a true statement from a man who had learned to say true things plainly. She felt it move through her like a current. That's a low bar, she said. And her voice came out slightly unsteady, in a way she hadn't intended. It's not actually, he said. I've been eating alone for 8 years. I know the difference. She looked down at the table for a moment. She thought about the first night they'd eaten together, the strangeness of passing the salt to a man whose habits she didn't know. And then she thought about how that strangeness had become ordinary, so much faster than she could have predicted. And how ordinary had become something else entirely. Something that had no clean word yet. Something that had been carefully not examining the way you had been carefully not examining the way you don't look directly at something bright because you're not sure you're ready for what you'll see. She looked up. I'd rather keep having supper with you too, she said. And then, because she had promised herself she would be honest with him. "That's not a small thing for me to say." "I know," he said. "That's why I asked." The moment sat between them complete and fragile, and neither of them moved to add to it. Because some things were better not elaborated on immediately after they were said. They needed room to be real before they were analyzed. Everett stood and cleared the cups from the table, and Clara gathered the documents and organized them into the stack she would carry to Henderson's tomorrow. And the ordinary movements of an ordinary evening re-established themselves around the extraordinary thing that had just been said in this kitchen, covering it gently the way snow covers ground, not erasing it, but giving it protection while it settled. Saturday morning, Clara woke early and lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the house. She could hear Everett already downstairs. She had learned the specific sounds of his morning boots on the kitchen floorboards, the particular sound of the coffee pot, the squeak of the back door going out and coming in again. She had learned them faster than she'd expected to learn anything about another person's habits. She got up, dressed, and went downstairs, and they ate quickly and rode to Henderson's. Henderson accepted the documents without asking unnecessary questions, which was one of the things Clara was coming to deeply appreciate about the particular kind of man who spent his life doing practical work in an unforgiving landscape. They understood instinctively what needed to be said and what did not. "My cousin in Sheridan sent the records," Henderson said, handing Clara a sealed envelope. "Came yesterday evening." She opened it at his kitchen table. 7 property transfers. 5 of them connected by the same pattern, a period of financial difficulty in the original family, followed by an approach from a representative claiming to offer assistance, followed by a transfer at below market value to an entity that turned out to be connected to Mountain Corridor. The transfer dates ranged across 14 years, the earliest predating Belle's first approach to her own family by 2 years. And running through every single one of them, like a seam through rock, was the preliminary route of the Northern Pacific's Wyoming survey. She set the envelope down. "It's all of them," she said. "All of them," Everett confirmed, looking over her shoulder. Henderson sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "This is going to be a significant legal matter." "Yes," Clara said. "Bigger than one lawyer in one county can manage." She had been thinking about that since Aldridge came to the ranch. "I know someone in Cheyenne," she said. "A woman named Grace Elias. She handled a territorial land case 2 years ago involving fraudulent mining claims across 4 counties. She won." She paused. "I'm going to write to her today." Henderson looked at her. "You know Grace Elias?" "My father knew her father. She came to the ranch twice when I was a child. I wrote to her 3 months ago about the initial matter with Belle. She said if it developed into something larger, to contact her." "And you think this qualifies as something larger?" Henderson said. Clara looked at the 7 transfer records spread across his table. She thought about the Mercer family, the Delacroix daughter who drove 2 counties to give testimony, the people whose names she hadn't found yet, the ones waiting in records she hadn't pulled. "I think this qualifies as something considerably larger," she said. She wrote to Grace Elias that afternoon. It was the most important letter she had written since the whole matter began, and she wrote it 4 times before she had it right complete enough to convey the scope, concise enough to be read in one sitting, specific enough to demonstrate that what she was presenting was evidence rather than speculation. She sealed it and handed it to Everett to take to the post station because she did not want to be seen in town herself right now. And he took it without comment. Sunday was the eye of the storm, the particular quiet that descends over a situation when everything that can currently be done has been done, and what remains is waiting. Clara spent part of the morning going through her documents one final time, checking and rechecking that the chain of evidence was clean and complete. She spent the afternoon with Pete going over the state of her cattle and the condition of the spring pasture, which would need attention soon regardless of what was happening in courtrooms and land offices. The ordinary work of the ranch had not stopped for any of this. The horses still needed feeding, and the fences still needed checking, and the cattle needed managing. And Clara had always found a specific comfort in the way the land continued to ask for what it had always asked for, indifferent to the human dramas playing out across it. It was not a cold indifference. It was a clarifying one. Sunday evening she and Everett sat on the porch in the cold for a while after supper, something they had started doing without planning to. Both of them bundled into coats, drinking the last of the day's coffee in the particular quiet that hour carried. Monday, she said. Monday, he agreed. Whatever Aldridge files Monday morning changes the nature of this permanently. Once it's filed, there's no version of this where we quietly step back. There was never a version of that, Everett said. Not after the forged deed. I know, I just want to say it out loud. She paused. I want to make sure I know what I'm committing to. He looked at her. Do you know? She thought about Grace Elias in Cheyenne. She thought about the 7 Sheridan County transfers spread across Henderson's table. She thought about her grandfather's letter and the judge who had signed it and the 50 years it had spent hidden in a Bible, waiting to be needed. Yes, she said. I know. Everett looked out at the dark for a moment. Then he said, I want you to know something. She waited. When you came to my door and asked me to help you protect your land, I said yes because it was right and because I could. He paused. But what we're doing now, this is different from that. This is bigger, and it's more dangerous, and it belongs entirely to you. I will stand beside it for as long as it runs. But I need you to understand that I'm not doing it because you're my wife or because I made an arrangement. He looked at her. I'm doing it because what's being done to these families is wrong, and you are the person willing to stop it. Clara held his gaze across the cold porch for a long moment. Everett, she said. Yes, I know. She held his gaze. I knew that about you before I came to your door. The cold settled around them, and neither of them spoke again for a while. And the silence was not empty. It was the fullest silence Clara had known in years. The kind that only exists between two people who have stopped needing to fill it. Monday morning came cold and clear and without hesitation. Aldridge's message arrived at 7. The handwriting analysis from Laramie had confirmed the signature on the forged deed was not Clara's grandfather's. The analysis was conclusive. The expert was prepared to testify. Clara read the message at the kitchen table with Everett standing beside her and felt the thing that she had been building toward for 10 days arrive with the finality of a door closing on one room and opening into another. She folded the message carefully. It's time, she said. And Marcus Bell, and Commissioner Dean, and Mountain Corridor Land Associates, and everyone above and below and beside all of them had no idea what was about to walk through that door. Aldridge filed the criminal complaint at 9 o'clock Monday morning, and by noon the news had moved through the county, the way serious news always moved in small places, faster than anyone planned. Slower than anyone feared, and with a momentum that nothing could stop once it had started. Clara knew it had landed when Everett came in from checking the horses at 2 in the afternoon and said, without preamble, Bell's lawyer rode out of town an hour ago. Heading south. Fast, she looked up from the table. Pratt, he confirmed. Henderson saw him at the South Road junction. He had luggage. Clara set down her pen. Pratt was not a man who ran. Pratt was a man who maneuvered and filed motions and made phone calls to people with influence. The fact that he was riding south with luggage on the same day the criminal complaint was filed meant one of two things. Either he had received word that the situation was about to deteriorate significantly and was removing himself before it did, or someone above Bell had decided that Pratt had become a liability and had told him to disappear. Either way, Marcus Bell had just lost his most capable legal protection. He's exposed, Clara said. Completely, Everett said. She stood up. I need to get to Aldridge. She was at Aldridge's office in 40 minutes. And what she found there sharpened everything. Aldridge had received a visitor that morning. An hour after the filing, a man from the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. Unannounced, who had asked to see the documentation supporting the criminal complaint. Aldridge had shown him nothing, which was correct, and had sent him away with the information that all evidence was currently held under attorney privilege, which was also correct. But the fact that a man from the Territorial Land Office had appeared in person in Aldridge's office within an hour of the filing told Clara everything she needed to know about the speed and reach of Commissioner Dean's network. "They have someone in the filing office," she said. "That's my conclusion," Aldridge said, "which means they knew about the complaint before the ink was dry." "Yes. And they sent someone directly here to assess the strength of our evidence." She thought fast. "They're deciding whether to suppress it or discredit it." "Or discredit you," Aldridge said carefully. She had expected that. What form would that take? Aldridge opened his desk drawer and placed a document in front of her. "This was served to my office this morning, before the land office man arrived. I didn't want to lead with it because I wanted you to understand the context first." Clara looked at the document. It was a counterfiling from Pratt's office filed, she noted, at 8:45 in the morning, 15 minutes before Aldridge had filed the criminal complaint. Which meant Bell's people had known the filing was coming before it happened. "They have someone in my office too," Aldridge said quietly. "Or someone who watches my movements closely enough to anticipate them." Clara read the counterfiling. It claimed that Clara Hayes, née Whitfield, had obtained her marriage to Everett Hayes through fraudulent misrepresentation, and that the marriage itself was therefore legally invalid, which would in turn invalidate her standing as co-petitioner on the title confirmation. She read it once, then she read it again. Then she set it down on the desk with both hands flat on the surface, and breathed for a moment. "They're going after the marriage," she said. "Yes. On what grounds specifically? They claim you represented to Everett Hayes that you were in a position to offer material compensation for his participation in the marriage arrangement, when in fact your financial position was." Aldridge stopped. "They're claiming you deceived him." Clara stood up. She was not angry, not yet. She was something colder and more precise than angry. The feeling that came when someone did something so deliberately calculated that it burned away everything except clarity. "Everett needs to see this today," she said. "I know," Aldridge said. "And I need Grace Elias here as fast as she can come. I sent a telegram this morning." She replied within 2 hours. Aldridge reached for a second paper. "She'll be here Thursday," Clara exhaled. "Thursday. 3 days. 3 days to hold the position before the cavalry arrived." "What do we file between now and Thursday?" she asked. "A response to the counterfiling," Aldridge said. "And I want to file a motion to have Pratt's conduct reviewed by the Territorial Bar, given that the counterfiling was submitted by his office this morning, and he was observed leaving the county with luggage this afternoon. That creates an ethical problem for the filing that the judge can't ignore." "Good," she said. "Do it today." She rode back to the ranch with the counterfiling folded in her coat pocket and the particular weight of it against her ribs the whole way. She thought about how to say it to Everett. She thought about the fact that Bell's people had taken a thing that was private and practical and quietly becoming something she did not yet have a word for, and had picked it up and turned it into a weapon. She thought about how much that infuriated her. And she thought about the fact that she was not going to let it show until she had said what needed to be said clearly and without the fury coloring it. Everett was in the barn when she got back. She went in and found him and handed him the counterfiling without a preamble and watched him read it. He read it to the end. Then he looked up at her. "They're claiming you deceived me," he said. "Yes." His expression was completely still, but she could see something moving underneath it. Something that was not as controlled as his face was. "Did Pratt file this before he left?" he asked. 8:45 this morning. "He left around noon. He filed it and then ran," Everett said. "Yes." He looked at the document again. Then he looked at her. "Clara, did you tell me anything that wasn't true?" The question was simple and direct and entirely sincere, which was the only way he asked questions. "No," she said. I told you I had limited resources and significant debt and a court matter that needed to be addressed urgently. All of that was true. And the part about compensation. Did you promise something you knew you couldn't provide? I said I would find a way to make it fair for you, she said carefully. I did not specify an amount because I didn't have one to specify. I don't think I misrepresented that. Everett was quiet for a moment. No, he said. You didn't. He folded the document and held it for a moment. They picked this because they thought it would divide us. Yes. Because a divided marriage is easier to challenge in court. And because if you chose to support the counterfiling, it would effectively end my standing in the title confirmation. She held his gaze. I'm not going to ask you not to. If you feel I misled you in any way, Clara, he said. And the way he said her name stopped her completely. Not harsh, not impatient. Something more final than either of those. Stop. She stopped. I know what you told me and what you didn't tell me, he said. I know the difference between deception and uncertainty. And I know exactly what I agreed to and why I agreed to it. He set the document down on the hay bale beside him. I'm not going to support a counterfiling built on a lie. She looked at him for a long moment. You're sure? I've been sure of very few things in my life, he said. I am sure of this. She felt the thing in her chest again. That specific and wordless thing, and this time she did not try to set it aside or examine it later. She let it be present, she let it be real. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me for doing the obvious thing, he said. Which was so entirely like him that she almost smiled. All right, she said. Then let's figure out how to destroy this counterfiling before Thursday. They went inside and worked through the evening with the focused intensity that had become the natural state of their life together over the past 2 weeks. Documents spread across the table. Coffee going cold beside them, the occasional exchange that was partly legal strategy and partly two people who had gotten very good at thinking together. Everett suggested something that Clara hadn't considered. A sworn affidavit from him, filed before the counterfiling could be heard, stating clearly and specifically that he had entered the marriage with complete understanding of Clara's financial situation and that no material misrepresentation had been made. It's not just a defense, he said. It's a counter-narrative. They claim you deceived me. I state under oath that you didn't. Now the judge has to weigh Bell's lawyer's claims against my sworn testimony, and Pratt has already left the county, Clara said. Which means the filing is effectively orphaned. No attorney of record to argue it in person. Which means the judge can dismiss it on procedural grounds before it even gets to substance, Everett said. How fast can Aldridge prepare the affidavit? Tonight. If I ride to him now. She looked at him. Tonight, he said. He was already reaching for his coat. She caught his arm. Not to stop him, just to catch him for a moment before he went. He stopped and looked at her, and she said, Everett, when this is done, whatever you decided, I want you to know that what I told you that first morning was true in every word. And what's happened since then? She stopped, gathered herself. I didn't expect this. Any of this part. I want you to know I know the difference between what I asked for and what this has become. He looked at her with that careful, complete attention. So do I, he said. We can talk about it properly when there's room to. He held her gaze for one more moment. There will be room to. Then he went to get Aldridge. He was back by 11 with the affidavit drafted and ready for his signature. He signed it at the kitchen table with Clara as witness. And she watched his handwriting, small and precise, and entirely his move across the page, and thought about how strange it was that she could identify a person's character in the way they wrote their own name. She filed it in the stack with everything else and went to bed and slept the way she had been sleeping since she came to this house, not perfectly, but better than she had in years, better than she deserved. Maybe given everything still unresolved, but real sleep, the kind that actual rest came from. Tuesday and Wednesday were a sustained exercise in controlled pressure. Aldridge filed the response to the counterfiling Tuesday morning, attaching Everett's affidavit and a motion to strike based on the abandonment of attorney of record. The judge accepted the motion for consideration. Bell, apparently, had retained a second local attorney, a younger man named Corver, who had been practicing in the county for 3 years, and who took the case. Clara suspected, because he didn't yet have the experience to understand exactly what he was walking into. Corver came to Aldridge's office Tuesday afternoon requesting a meeting. Clara was there when he arrived, and she watched him take in the room the organized stacks of documentation, the Sheridan County records, the criminal complaint filed and stamped, and she watched him understand, in real time, that this was considerably more than a property dispute between a widow and a businessman. "Mr. Bell would like to discuss resolution," Corver said carefully. Mr. Bell's settlement window closed when he filed a forged deed on Friday afternoon, Clara said. She kept her voice completely even. "The matter is now criminal in nature." "That is not a conversation about resolution." Corver looked at her. He was young enough to still be surprised by things. "Mrs. Hayes, I have to advise you that my client has significant resources and considerable connections in this county and territory." "I know exactly what connections your client has," Clara said. "I know about Mountain Corridor Land Associates. I know about the Denver Holding Company. I know about the Sheridan County transfers and the preliminary railroad survey." She watched him go pale at each item on the list. "I know about Commissioner Dean's legal firm. I know about the nervous young man from Denver who filed a forged deed at the county registrar on a Friday afternoon and told the clerk he worked for a law firm." She paused. "The registrar remembers him very clearly, Mr. Corver." "Does your client know how clearly?" Corver was quiet for a long moment. "Your client's best available position right now," Clara continued, "is full cooperation with the criminal proceeding and a formal acknowledgement of the fraudulent transfers across all 3 counties. Anything short of that, and this goes to the territorial level, and Commissioner Dean answers questions he is not going to want to answer." Corver stood up. He was not going to say anything useful, and he knew it. "I'll relay your position to my client," he said. "Please do," Clara said. After he left, Aldridge looked at her with the expression he had been wearing more and more frequently in recent days, the one that suggested he was significantly revising his initial assessment of who he was dealing with. "You named Dean directly," he said. "Yes. Without confirmation that Dean is actually implicated. I have confirmation of his legal firm's connection to Mountain Corridor," Clara said. "I named what I know. I let him draw his own conclusions about what else I might know." She looked at Aldridge. "Does Bell know exactly where the boundary of my evidence is?" Aldridge considered that. "No, he doesn't." "Then he can't calculate his risk accurately," Clara said. "Which is more expensive for him than knowing the exact number." She saw Aldridge recognize his own earlier words reflected back in a different mouth. And she saw him understand that she had been listening to everything this whole time. Grace Elias arrived Thursday morning on the early coach from Cheyenne, and she was exactly what Clara remembered from childhood, a tall, composed woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, and the particular economy of movement that came from spending decades in rooms where other people expected you to take up less space than you were entitled to and deciding long ago not to comply. She embraced Clara briefly at the door, and then looked at her at arm's length and said, "You've grown into someone formidable." "I've had motivation," Clara said. Grace laughed a short, real laugh and came incisive and met Everett, who shook her hand and gave her coffee and left the room to let them work. Which Grace apparently noticed because she said, once he was gone, "That's an unusual man." "Yes," Clara said. "He understands that this is yours to run." "Yes, good," Grace said simply, and sat down and opened her case. What followed was 4 hours that Clara would remember for the rest of her life as the moment the full scope of the thing became real, in a way that documents and legal strategy had only suggested. Grace had come not just as a lawyer but as someone who had already, in the 3 days since Clara's letter reached her, made inquiries of her own through channels that existed at a level of the territorial system that Clara hadn't had access to. What those inquiries had found was this: Mountain Corridor Land Associates was not the top. It was the middle. Above it was an investment syndicate with members in Denver, Cheyenne, and Kansas City, several of whom had direct social and financial connections to the Federal Railroad Commission. The Wyoming Railroad Survey had been conducted privately, funded through the syndicate, and its route had been shared with syndicate members 18 months before any public announcement. Commissioner Dean was one of 11 individuals who had received advance route information and had used it to identify acquisition targets. Marcus Bell had been one of 3 operators running acquisitions in Wyoming on the syndicate's behalf. The other 2 were still working in counties east of Clara's, unknown and undetected. When Grace finished laying this out, the kitchen was very quiet. "How many families?" Clara said. "Across 3 operators in Wyoming, our current estimate is 23 properties," Grace said. "Possibly more in Colorado and Montana if the syndicate was operating there as well. 23 families. 23 sets of people who had sat at their own kitchen tables, doing math that never worked out, who had been approached by men with official-looking documents and reasonable-sounding offers at their most vulnerable moments, who had signed their land away for a fraction of what it would be worth the moment the railroad announcement came." Clara felt something move through her that was not just anger. It was something heavier and more sustained than anger. The kind of feeling that settles in and becomes a commitment. "What do we need to make the federal case?" she asked. "What you have," Grace said, "is a foundation. The criminal complaint on the forged deed is your anchor. The Mountain Corridor transfer records from Sheridan County establish the pattern. The connection between Dean's legal firm and the holding company creates the territorial dimension." She paused. "But to go federal, we need to establish that the syndicate used the Federal Railroad Survey as the basis for their acquisitions. That requires someone inside the syndicate to confirm the timeline." "A witness," Clara said. "Someone who knew about the route before it was public and can document that they shared it with Mountain Corridor and its associated operators." Pratt knew, Everett said from the doorway. He had apparently been listening from the hall, and neither Clara nor Grace seemed to find this inappropriate. "Yes," Grace said. Pratt knew. "Which is why he left the county 3 days ago. He ran because he's scared," Everett said. "Scared men can be found, and found men can be offered a choice." Grace looked at him with sharpened attention. "What choice?" "Pratt is Bell's lawyer. He's not the syndicate. He's the kind of person who was hired to manage legal problems for people above him." Everett came fully into the room and stood at the table. "If the federal case proceeds and he's identified as a knowing participant, he faces the same exposure as Bell and Dean. But if he cooperates before the federal proceeding begins, he has something to offer in exchange for his own position." "You're describing a cooperation agreement," Grace said. "I'm describing the obvious thing," Everett said. "He ran because he was scared. You find him and you give him a door. Most scared men will walk through a door when they see one." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Clara. "Your husband thinks practically." "He does," Clara said. "Can Henderson find Pratt?" Grace asked Everett directly. "Henderson can ask the right people," Everett said. "Which is not the same thing but is usually faster." Grace nodded. "Do it." Henderson found Pratt in 4 days. Not through any elaborate investigation, simply by asking the right people the right question. Pratt had gone to a hotel in Laramie under his own name, which was either extremely arrogant or extremely frightened. And frightened people often did arrogant things because arrogance was the costume they knew how to wear. Grace took the coach to Laramie herself. She was gone 2 days. She came back with a signed statement. Pratt had confirmed the timeline. He had confirmed the route information was shared with Mountain Corridor before public announcement. He had confirmed 7 names in the syndicate, including 3 with federal appointments. And he had confirmed, in writing, that he had prepared the fraudulent deed filed at the county registrar at Marcus Bell's explicit direction, executed by a Denver associate whose name he also provided. When Clara read the statement at the kitchen table, she felt the full weight of everything she had been carrying for the past 3 weeks settle and then not lift. Exactly, transform. Into something with a shape and an ending and a defined boundary. She looked up at Grace. It's enough. It's more than enough, Grace said. Federal prosecutors in Cheyenne have been looking for a way into the syndicate for 2 years. What we have gives them the door. And the families, Clara said. The 23. What happens to them? The fraudulent transfers can be challenged on the basis of criminal deception. Some will be recoverable. All of them will have standing to file civil claims against the syndicate and its assets. Grace paused. It won't be fast. None of the recovery will be fast. But it will be real. Real, Clara held onto that word. The federal prosecutors came to the county 3 weeks later. Marcus Bell was formally arrested on a Tuesday morning, 9 weeks after Clara had knocked on Everett's door before sunrise. Commissioner Dean resigned his position the same week, citing personal reasons which fooled no one and was not intended to. 3 of the syndicate's 11 members retained federal counsel. The other 8 began a negotiation that Grace managed from Cheyenne with the particular methodical precision of a woman who had been waiting her entire career for a case exactly this significant. The county held a formal confirmation of Clara's title deed on a Thursday afternoon in the same room where Judge Harlan had denied Bell's original motion. It was technically an administrative proceeding, dry and procedural. The kind of thing that generated paperwork rather than drama. But Clara stood in that room and heard her name attached to her land in the permanent, formal, legally unassailable way, and she felt something complete itself inside her that had been incomplete for 3 years. Since her father's death, since the first moment she had stood in the kitchen alone with the ledger and understood that she was the only one left to protect what he'd built. It was done. It was real. It was hers. Everett was standing beside her when the clerk stamped the final document, exactly where he had been in every room for the past 9 weeks, not in front of her, not behind her, but beside, the specific placement of a man who understood the difference. She looked at him after the clerk handed her the stamped copy, and he looked back at her with that expression she had learned to read completely, the one that in anyone else might have been a wide-open smile, but in Everett was something quieter and more enduring. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. She thought about the first morning, the dark porch, the wind, his single quiet yes that had changed the entire shape of her life. She thought about everything that had happened in 9 weeks, the forged deed, the nervous Denver lawyer, the Sheridan County records, spread across Henderson's table, Grace Elias arriving on the Thursday coach, Pratt's signed statement. 23 families she had never met who would spend the next several years fighting to recover what had been taken from them, and who would have a fighting chance because a woman in Wyoming had refused to stop pulling a thread. She thought about supper. She thought about the fence they had fixed in the cold. She thought about a man who brought coffee at 10 o'clock and read documents sideways and said, simply and without embellishment, that he'd rather keep having supper with her than not. "Everett," she said. "Yes, what you said on the porch." "About supper, I remember," he said. "I've been thinking about it since I know," he said. And then, with the particular directness of a man who had spent 8 years alone and had no patience left for unnecessary distance, "What did you decide?" She looked at him, this quiet, careful, entirely honest man who had said yes before he knew the whole picture and had never once looked back from it. "I decided," she said, "that I don't want a 6-month arrangement or a year-long arrangement. I don't want an arrangement at all." She held his gaze. "I want a marriage. A real one, with you." Everett looked at her for a long moment. The kind of moment that has weight and substance and does not need to be hurried. "That's what I was hoping you'd decide," he said. "Was it obvious?" she asked. "Only to me," he said. "Because I was looking," she laughed. A real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she hadn't heard herself make in so long that the sound of it was almost surprising. Everett's expression shifted into the thing that was not quite a smile but was everything. A smile was supposed to be warm and present and aimed entirely at her. He reached out and took her hand, right there in the county clerk's office with Mrs. Denton watching from behind her desk with an expression that had finally, decisively, moved past professional neutrality into something that looked a great deal like satisfaction. They walked out into the cold air together, and Clara Hayes held the stamped deed in one hand and her husband's hand in the other. And the wind was entirely still for the first time in weeks. And the sky was the particular clear blue that only exists in Wyoming in early spring when the worst of the winter has finally broken and everything that survived it knows it's still standing. She had come to this county as Clara Whitfield, a woman alone with a failing ranch and 2 days before a court hearing, and nothing but a letter hidden in a Bible and the stubborn refusal to go down without a fight. She was leaving that clerk's office as a woman who had exposed a 12-year fraud, protected her family's land, helped 23 families find their way toward justice. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, without planning for it, without quite noticing the exact moment it happened, had built a life with a quiet man who understood that the truest form of love was not rescue. It was standing beside. The ranch never bore the name of the fight that almost took it. In the years that followed, it was simply known as the Hayes place, well managed, debt-free, running the best cattle in the county, tended by 2 people who worked side by side without either of them needing to be in front. Pete grew into a man who had the confidence that comes from being trusted early. And he managed his own section of the land with the same steady competence Clara had seen in him from the beginning. Grace Elias won the federal case, and 3 of the affected families recovered their land within 2 years. The others took longer, but they did not stop, because they now had evidence and standing and a lawyer who did not give up on things simply because they were difficult. Marcus Bell was convicted. Commissioner Dean resigned in disgrace. The syndicate's assets were frozen while federal proceedings ran their course. And every evening, in a kitchen that had once been a quiet man's solitary domain and was now the warm and specific center of 2 people's shared life, Clara and Everett sat down to supper together. The woman who had ridden through the dark and the wind to ask a stranger for something she needed had found something she had never thought to ask for a man who gave her his yes freely, his presence completely, and his belief in her absolutely. And the man who had lived alone long enough to know the difference between quiet and peace had discovered. On an early morning, when a woman knocked on his door before sunrise, that peace was not a thing a person built alone. It was a thing 2 people built together, day by day, starting with something as small and as sufficient as a single honest word.
Yes.